In relationships, when someone with an anxious attachment finally walks away from an avoidant, it often feels like a shift of power. The avoidant may have believed they held control by keeping distance, but when the anxious partner decides they've had enough, that's when the tables turn. What begins as freedom for the avoidant often transforms into a nightmare they didn't expect. Avoidants often walk into relationships carrying the belief that they are the ones in control. They see themselves as the ones holding the power because they are the ones who create distance. They are the ones who decide when to lean in and when to pull back. They are the ones who dictate how much closeness is allowed and how much space is maintained. And because of this rhythm, they assume that they are safe. They assume the anxious person will always be there to fill the gap, to reach out, to bridge the silence. And so long as that pattern repeats, the avoidant convinces themselves that they are untouchable, that they hold the upper hand, that they are the ones who set the tone of the relationship without realizing that this belief is built entirely on the anxious person's willingness to stay and fight for them. The anxious partner is often the one who overextends themselves, the one who apologizes first, the one who sends the message when the avoidant goes quiet, the one who reassures, explains, and pours energy into keeping the connection alive even when it feels one-sided. They are the ones who sacrifice their own peace of mind to maintain a sense of closeness. And this effort builds a dynamic where the avoidant begins to assume it will never change. They begin to think that no matter how many times they retreat, no matter how cold they turn, no matter how distant they become, the anxious person will always come back, always forgive, always repair the damage, and that belief becomes the foundation of their control. But what the avoidant forgets is that the anxious person has a breaking point. They can only fight so long before exhaustion sets in. They can only chase for so long before they feel the imbalance swallowing them. They can only endure the cycle of closeness and rejection until they realize their own worth has been buried under constant pursuit. And when that realization happens, the energy shifts dramatically because suddenly the anxious partner is no longer chasing, no longer fighting, no longer willing to absorb the pain just to keep the bond alive. They reach a place where leaving is no longer a fear, but a necessity. And in that moment, the dynamic the avoidant relied upon collapses. When the anxious person walks away, it shatters the illusion of control the avoidant has been living in. Suddenly, the one they believed would always be there is gone. The constant reassurance they secretly depended on is cut off. The security of knowing someone would always bridge the gap is gone. And with that loss, the avoidant is forced to confront the reality that their control was never real. It was borrowed power sustained by the anxious person's effort. It was not strength but dependence disguised as detachment. And when the anxious leaves, the avoidant no longer holds the strings. They are left standing in the silence they once thought was comfortable, only now it feels like emptiness. What makes this moment so powerful is not just the absence of the anxious partner, but the collapse of the narrative the avoidant has built for themselves. They told themselves they didn't need anyone. They told themselves they valued freedom more than intimacy. They told themselves they could pull away whenever they wanted without consequence. And for so long, it seemed true because the anxious person was always there to validate those choices. But when that anxious person leaves, all of those beliefs are tested against reality. And suddenly the avoidant is no longer the one making the choice. Suddenly they are the one being left behind, and that shift in power forces them to feel what they've spent their whole lives avoiding. This is the hidden truth that makes the anxious leaving such a profound turning point. It exposes the fragile foundation beneath the avoidant's confidence. It reveals that their control was only an illusion maintained by someone else's willingness to fight for the relationship. It shows them that distance is not the same as strength, and that pushing people away does not guarantee safety, because once the anxious partner chooses themselves, once they stop being the glue that holds everything together, the avoidant is left with the very thing they feared the most, not freedom, not independence, but abandonment. And in that moment, the roles are reversed in a way the avoidant never imagined. Avoidants may present themselves as independent and detached. They tell themselves they don't need constant validation. They act as though reassurance is unnecessary. and they create an image of being strong enough to stand alone without leaning on anyone else. But beneath that image lies a quiet dependency that often goes unacknowledged, because every time the anxious partner reaches out, every time they chase after silence, every time they try to fix the distance, the avoidant receives validation they pretend not to need. It tells them that no matter how much they push away, someone still wants them, someone still values them, someone still chooses them even in the face of rejection, and that silent confirmation becomes the fuel that keeps their world in balance. The anxious person doesn't always realize the role they are playing in feeding this hidden need, because their natural instinct to bridge gaps and close emotional distance feels like love. It feels like care. It feels like the right thing to do in order to save the relationship. But what they are really doing is providing the avoidant with constant reminders that they are wanted, that they matter, that no matter how far they retreat, someone will always be there to pull them back. And over time, this cycle becomes the unspoken contract between them. One gives validation endlessly, and the other consumes it while pretending it isn't necessary. And this is how the balance of power is maintained without either side truly confronting what is happening. But when the anxious person finally decides to leave, that supply of validation is cut off in an instant, and it is only then that the avoidant realizes just how much they depended on it. Suddenly the messages stop, the apologies are no longer offered, the effort to repair and reconnect is gone, and with that absence comes a deep and unsettling void, because for the first time the avoidant is not being pursued. For the first time, no one is running after them when they step back, and that silence is not the freedom they once imagined, but an echo of everything they have lost, a mirror reflecting how much they relied on the anxious partner's energy to confirm their value. This moment is often the most jarring for an avoidant, because they built their identity around being untouchable, around believing they were unaffected by closeness or distance, around convincing themselves that they were complete without needing anyone else's reassurance. But when the anxious leaves the cracks in that belief show, the truth rises to the surface that they were never as unaffected as they appeared, that every chase, every gesture of care, every attempt to heal the distance was silently feeding their sense of importance, and now without it they are confronted with an emptiness that feels unbearable, a loss of validation they had built into the structure of their relationship without even realizing it. The irony is that the anxious partner often leaves not because they stopped caring, but because they finally realized their worth. They finally saw that chasing was costing them their peace, that constantly giving validation was depleting their energy, that waiting for reciprocity from someone who withheld it was breaking them down, and in reclaiming their power, they inadvertently create the avoidance nightmare, because suddenly the avoidant has to face what it feels like to not be chased, to not be needed, to not be reminded of their value in every silence. And this reversal hits harder than anything else, because it exposes just how dependent they had become on the very dynamic they once resented. What follows is often confusion for the avoidant. They don't understand why the absence of validation feels so painful. They may even convince themselves that they miss the person, when in reality they miss the way that person made them feel about themselves. They miss the assurance that they mattered. They miss the security of knowing someone would always try to keep them close, no matter how far they withdrew. And this realization can shake the foundation of their attachment style, because it forces them to acknowledge that their distance was not strength, their detachment was not independence. It was a pattern that relied on someone else's effort to sustain it. And without that effort, the avoidant is left with nothing but the silence they created. Avoidants are often quick to equate their need for space with strength. They convince themselves that pulling away is proof of independence, that creating distance means they are in control, that refusing to lean on anyone is a form of emotional resilience. And for a long time, this belief shields them from having to face the vulnerability they carry inside. They treat detachment like a badge of honor, something that protects them from the risk of being hurt. And they convince themselves that if they appear indifferent, then no one can ever truly touch them. But what they fail to recognize is that independence built on avoidance is not strength. It is fear disguised as self-sufficiency. In the cycle of their relationships, they tell themselves that their lack of emotional response is proof of control. that their ability to detach means they are unaffected, that stepping back when things feel too intense is the right way to preserve themselves. But the truth is that this behavior creates a shield that keeps them disconnected from their own emotions. And while they may call it independence, it is really indifference to intimacy, an unwillingness to step into the discomfort of closeness. And because the anxious partner often keeps showing up, keeps fighting, keeps proving love even through the distance, the avoidant never has to confront whether their indifference is real or simply a mask. The revelation comes when the anxious partner finally stops chasing, when the calls stop coming, when the messages stop filling the silence, when the endless reassurance disappears, because in that absence, the avoidant is suddenly faced with a reality they never planned for. The shield of indifference begins to crack under the weight of silence, and the independence they once glorified begins to feel more like isolation. What they thought was strength is exposed as a coping mechanism. What they thought was freedom begins to feel like abandonment, and it is in this void that their hidden fears begin to surface in ways they cannot ignore. At first, the avoidant may fight this realization. They may double down on the story they tell themselves, convincing their mind that they don't need the anxious partner, that the absence is a relief, that the silence is peace. But as time stretches and the pursuit does not return, the discomfort grows louder because suddenly they are not choosing distance. Distance has been chosen for them, and the difference between those two realities shakes the foundation of their attachment. It highlights that what they feared all along was not intimacy, but rejection, not closeness, but abandonment. And now in the emptiness left behind, they feel the very thing they worked so hard to avoid. The absence reveals a truth the avoidant has long kept hidden from themselves, that beneath the mask of control is the deep human need to feel wanted, to feel seen, to feel valued. And when that source of reassurance disappears, the fear of being unlovable rises to the surface. The fear of being left behind becomes undeniable, and the narrative of independence collapses. They begin to see that what they mistook for strength was actually an armor built around insecurity, that their detachment was not confidence but protection. And in losing the anxious partner's presence, they are forced to face that the indifference they displayed was not genuine, but a cover for the very vulnerability they never wanted to reveal. What makes this realization so powerful is that it does not arrive gently. It comes crashing into the avoidant in the silence of absence. It is the quiet moments when no one is chasing, no one is checking in, no one is reaching out that the truth becomes unavoidable. They finally feel the sting of disconnection, not as freedom, but as loss. And it is then that their hidden fears come alive. The fear of being unworthy, the fear of being forgotten, the fear of being unloved. And those fears strip away the illusion of independence they once held so tightly, leaving them exposed to the reality that the indifference they leaned on was never strength, but denial of their deeper emotional needs. When the anxious partner finally decides to walk away, it does something to the avoidant that they never anticipated, because for so long they relied on the certainty that no matter how much distance they created, the anxious person would always come back. There was always this underlying safety net that made them feel secure even in their detachment. But when that net disappears, it forces the avoidant into a place of regret they never thought they would experience. Suddenly, they begin to look back at all the moments they dismissed closeness, all the times they shut down when the other person reached out, all the opportunities they had to show love but instead chose distance, and those choices no longer feel like control but like mistakes that cannot be undone. At first, regret shows up quietly, maybe in the middle of the night when the avoidant reaches for their phone and realizes there are no new messages waiting for them, maybe in the moments when they pass by places they once shared with the anxious partner, maybe in the silence of realizing the attention they took for granted has vanished. And as those realizations build, they begin to feel the weight of what has been lost. It is not just the absence of a person, but the absence of security. The absence of someone who made them feel wanted, even when they resisted. And that absence begins to sting in a way that detachment never protected them from. Reflection soon follows because the mind of the avoidant cannot ignore the patterns that led to this point. They begin to replay the arguments where they walked away instead of listening. They remember the messages they left unanswered. They think about the walls they built in moments when the anxious partner was simply asking for connection. And these memories do not feel like independence anymore. They feel like missed chances to build something deeper. They feel like doors closed too soon. And in the quiet of being alone, those reflections turn into uncomfortable truths. Truths that reveal the cost of avoidance is not freedom, but loneliness. The realization of lost security cuts deeper than most avoidants expect, because part of what made their detachment feel safe was knowing someone else was always there to close the gap. It allowed them to believe they could withdraw without consequence. But when the anxious partner leaves, it dismantles that belief, and what remains is the awareness that security was never in their distance. Security was in the presence of someone who cared enough to bridge the gap, and without that presence, the avoidant feels exposed, unanchored, and unsure of themselves. The silence that once felt protective now feels like vulnerability. The independence that once felt strong now feels like abandonment. This is the shift that makes the departure of the anxious so impactful. It flips the script in a way the avoidant cannot control, because no matter how much they try to convince themselves that they are fine on their own, the loss keeps resurfacing, and every reminder of the anxious partner becomes a reminder of the safety they once had, the safety of being wanted, the safety of knowing someone cared enough to try again and again. And without it, they are left in a space where regret and reflection are unavoidable, where the weight of lost security becomes a daily experience, where the silence forces them to sit with emotions they spent their lives trying to escape. The painful irony is that the avoidant often realizes the value of the anxious partner only in their absence, when the reassurance is no longer there, when the effort is no longer given, when the patience has run out. It is then that the regret feels sharpest. It is then that reflection feels heaviest. And it is then that the realization of lost security feels undeniable, because they are finally confronted with the truth that the safety they felt in being chased, in being validated, in being chosen repeatedly, was never guaranteed. It was a gift. And once that gift is gone, the avoidant finds themselves longing for the very closeness they once resisted. For so long, the avoidant convinces themselves that closeness is suffocating. They see intimacy as something that threatens their freedom. They believe emotional vulnerability is too heavy to carry, and because of that belief, they run from it whenever it appears. They retreat when someone gets too close. They shut down when affection feels overwhelming. They hide behind walls when love asks them to show up fully, and in that running, they believe they are protecting themselves. But what they cannot see is that the very thing they are pushing away is the thing that provides meaning, the thing that grounds them, the thing that gives them a sense of belonging. When the anxious partner was still in their life, the avoidant had the luxury of resisting. They had the security of knowing that no matter how many times they pulled back, someone would still be there to hold the door open, to wait, to try again. And this made their running feel safe, because deep down they knew they were not truly losing the person. They knew that even if they created distance, the anxious would come closer, and so running became a pattern, a reflex, a way of maintaining the illusion of control without ever having to face the consequences of losing what they were resisting. It felt like a game they could always win. But the moment the anxious partner finally decides to walk away, everything changes, the game ends, the dynamic flips, and the avoidant is forced to experience a reality they never planned for, because suddenly the closeness they once ran from is no longer available. The affection they rejected is no longer offered. The reassurance they ignored is no longer given. And it is in that moment they realize that what they had been running from all along is the very thing they now crave. The warmth of intimacy, the comfort of affection, the certainty of being loved by someone who cared enough to stay. This reversal is one of the most disorienting experiences for an avoidant, because it reveals how much their behavior was rooted in fear rather than freedom. They thought running made them strong, but now chasing exposes how much they need what they once resisted. They thought detachment meant independence, but now absence shows them that independence feels empty without connection. And so the very pattern they used to protect themselves begins to betray them. It leaves them yearning for the closeness they once dismissed, searching for the love they once pushed away, regretting the moments they turned their back on what they secretly wanted most. The chase that follows is not always straightforward. Sometimes it shows up in the avoidant trying to reconnect with the anxious partner after they leave. Sometimes it reveals itself in a longing they cannot silence, even if they never reach out. Sometimes it manifests as an ache they carry into future relationships where they desperately try to find the same kind of devotion they once had. But in every form, it is the same truth, that the thing they once feared becomes the thing they desire most, that the intimacy they rejected becomes the intimacy they cannot stop thinking about, that the love they avoided becomes the love they now pursue, even when it feels out of reach.